You've probably heard this time and time again that eating saturated fat increases your risk for type 2 diabetes. It's a common teaching that we see all the time, but turns out it's not true. And a new study shows kind of why it's not true in a way. I want to go over this study with you, and more importantly, I want to help you understand simple things you can look for in studies like this and other studies to say, can I believe this? Is it likely true or not? Is it going to be helpful for me as an individual? I'm Dr. Brett Scher, the medical director at DietDoctor.com, and at Diet Doctor we've done so many videos about these types of studies trying to show one type of food group or one macronutrient or, even individual foods and their risk for disease and how it's so weak. The level of evidence is so low, it's so weak quality evidence that it's really not helpful for you. But what I want to do here is briefly go over the study, but then talk about more in general what you should be looking for to decide if any of these studies are helpful for you or what you can take away from them. So here we go. The study is called Saturated Fatty Acid Intake and Risk of Type 2 Diabetes, an updated systematic review and dose response meta-analysis of cohort studies, and it was published in the journal Nutrition. Big, long title. But basically what they did was they looked at 13 cohort studies, right? So not randomized controlled trials, but cohort studies where you just follow populations and sort of do the crunch the data part. So 13 prospective cohort studies of over 360,000 participants. And it was sort of from all around. There were 6 from Europe, 5 from the United States, and 2 from Australia, with follow-up between 4 and 17 years. And what they looked at was the saturated fat intake and the risk of type 2 diabetes. And the main conclusion is there was no relationship. There was no increased risk of type 2 diabetes for those who ate the most versus the least amount of saturated fat. But they went even further and they broke down the saturated fat into the specific types of saturated fat. So specifically, they looked at lauric acid, myristic acid, palmitic acid, and stearic acid. And interesting, what they found was lauric acid and myristic acid had a negative association, meaning those who ate the most versus the least had a lower risk of type 2 diabetes. Now, that doesn't prove that these protect against type 2 diabetes, but certainly shows they're not going to increase your risk. And then when they looked at palmitic and stearic acid, which are kind of more in animal-based foods, meats and dairy and eggs and things like that, that there was no association at all, either positive or negative. And lauric acid and myristic acid, those are sort of more the plant oils, I guess you can say, saturated fats. So the key is that when you look at studies that try to look at one specific food, these are complicated by so many other factors because it is the dietary matrix that matters, not the specific food, right? Does this study show that saturated fats are protective against type 2 diabetes? No, because we know if you eat a diet that's high in carbs, high in fat, high in calories, standard American diet, you're getting your saturated fats from baked goods and ultra-processed foods and ice creams and desserts and meats and eggs. If you're getting saturated fats from all those sources and you're overeating calories, you are at higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes. But is it the saturated fat? No, it's not the specific saturated fat. It's the dietary matrix. And when you look at studies like that, they frequently have a strong healthy user bias. Those who eat the most saturated fats are the least healthy at baseline and take the least care of themselves. They smoke the most, they drink the most alcohol, they exercise the least, they probably sleep the least, right? And they probably seek out healthcare the least and meditate the least or whatever, right? Like there's a strong healthy user bias. But what this study showed, even overcoming that healthy user bias, there's no association, no increased association with saturated fat and type 2 diabetes. So I promised in the beginning I was going to try and help you understand how to evaluate these studies. Well, the first thing you want to do is look at the baseline characteristics. And if those who eat the most of a certain food group, whether it's red meat or eggs or saturated fat or whatever they're trying to look at, if they are unhealthier at baseline, less healthy at baseline, that's a problem because that's going to confound the variables. That's going to confound the outcome. Then what what is the outcome? The hazard ratio that they give you. Is it 1.1? Is it 1.2? Those are minuscule differences that really for an individual mean nothing and probably statistically mean nothing. Remember, for smoking, it was like 15 to 30, not 1.15, not 1.30, but 15. And here we're talking about 1.1 and 1.2. Minuscule differences that really mean nothing. Then look at the overall dietary context. Like I'm saying, we have plenty of evidence that if you're following a low-carb diet, completely unrestricted in animal foods and red meats and unrestricted in saturated fats, that those diets, that dietary matrix can reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes, can help you reverse your type 2 diabetes, get off your diabetes medications. So clearly, it's not the saturated fat if these diets are unrestricted in saturated fat and still helping people reverse their type 2 diabetes, improve their blood sugar control. So why would people want to kind of pin it on saturated fat? Well, you know, there's this movement that plant-based is better, animal-based is bad, and we have the evidence to quote-unquote support it based on these very poor quality, low quality evidence, nutrition epidemiology. But then we have other studies like this that completely go against that show it's actually not the saturated fat. So that's the big take home. It's the dietary matrix. Now, if you can eat a plant-based diet with no animal foods and not be hungry and be able to do it logistically in your life and hit your healthy weight loss goals and maintain good body composition, get your adequate protein, that's perfectly fine. You don't need animal products. But if you struggle to achieve all those goals, then absolutely you should look to animal-based foods because there's no proof that in a healthy dietary context that animal-based foods are harmful or that saturated fat itself is harmful in a healthy dietary matrix, a healthy dietary context. I can only say that so many times to really hammer that home. So please, 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 when you see studies that are nutrition epidemiology studies trying to demonize one type of food or to point blame on one specific food or one specific food type, look at the baseline characteristics, look for healthy user bias, look for the degree of association with the hazard ratio, and look for the overall dietary matrix. Hopefully that helps you sort of understand how to best approach these studies because it's so important. There's so much misinformation out there, and you want to know, what does this mean for me as an individual, my dietary choices, my health? And that's what's really hard to make the connection, but hopefully this little guidance can help you. All right, please click thumbs up and subscribe if this was helpful, and we'll see you here next time on Diet Doctor News on YouTube. Thanks a lot, everybody.